So I will go and ask.
I will call the St. Paul City Council Organizational Committee to order. Good morning. It is Wednesday, the 15th of June, and we are convening our org committee, which is a regularly scheduled Wednesday morning meeting. We have, for context, have made a decision that it is better to have policy sessions in advance of our city's budget, and I think that in order to be prepared when we come into budget season, which is really our primary role, and have these conversations as opposed to having policy conversations during the budget, when a lot of times it's too late to make decisions about funding and what have you. Today's presentation, I think, fits nicely into that niche of having conversations early in advance. About a year ago today, we established a committee, the St. Paul Legislative Advisory Committee on Reparations, whose primary task was to establish a commission, an ongoing standing commission recommendation for an ordinance to do so. So now, after a year of hard work, we are hearing a presentation from the members of the committee, some of the members of the committee, representatives, and we'll hear their recommendations, we'll hear their learnings, and discuss next steps. I will say that Uhuru, who will be our primary presenter today, has a tail lights request. He needs to be out of here for another appointment, so we're going to keep things on schedule so that we can get through the material. I will say we have been very grateful to be kept along for the ride during the course of the year. So I think many of the questions that my colleagues and I have had, we've had an opportunity to ask as you've gone through the process. So you may find that most of our questions are answered because of the thoroughness of the presentation and because you brought us along for the journey. But we will try to get through the materials in the time that we have allotted to us. So I will look to Jane to see if there's anything else that we need to add and before we get started and keep moving here today.
Very good. I just want to say I spoke to some members of our audience who said, in fact, one of your Ward 2 constituents is here, and she said, "I'm here to see us make history." And so I want to say that in Mr. Cruz, Trerin Cruz, came up with launched the idea of a St. Paul Recovery Act reparations ordinance several years ago. And I want to say that what is really moving about what happened today, what is about to happen today, is that when George Floyd was tragically murdered in 2020, this community said we can never go back to where we have been. We have got to make a real commitment to change and to equality. And at that point, Trerin's ordinance suddenly emerged as the thing that St. Paul can do to ensure that we never go back. So with that, I want to thank the members of the committee who are here, and our three co-chairs, conveners, Veronica Burt, Uhuru Williams, and Trerin Cruz, for leading this vitally important work. Thank you.
Turn things over to the committee.
Thank you. Did you want to answer me, Rush, or do you want me to? Okay, that's fine. We'll go ahead and get started. First,
There you go. And you might need to pull it up just a little bit.
thank you.
Perfect.
I want to acknowledge the St. Paul City Council. It has been almost a year ago to this day, and we would not be sitting here making this presentation to this body if there hadn't been leadership on this council to forward this work. We do believe it's a momentous moment. To echo the person from Ward 2 who made the comment about us being in a position where we can establish or make history, I think that's very important. And there are some things that guided this work that speak to the unique contours of this moment that extend beyond just the George Floyd incident. As you see in that first slide, and we talk about the background here, a big part of the context is what has been the history of racial injustice in the United States, going back to the establishment of slavery, talking about deliberate policies, practices, and procedures that have contributed to the continuation of injustice, particularly toward the African American community. And we can see that in the city of St. Paul, in the Dred Scott decision and the positioning of Dred and Harriet Scott in this state and its relation to this community. We can talk about this in terms of the Rondo community. We could talk about this in terms of mass incarceration. We can talk about this in terms of any number of issues that in our contemporary moment continue to loom large in broader conversations about why there is not the ability to build intergenerational wealth in the African American community in particular. And that was the charge that we got from this body. So thank you for that, because I do believe that we're in a unique position right now as a result. Having said that, we wanted to ensure and center the council's attention on some larger principles that we think are going to be essential to long-term success. And they're threefold. Number one, we believe that in order for there to be a sense in community that this is a serious endeavor, it needs to be backed up by adequate funding and programming, and should include some conversation about possible direct payments to those who were aggrieved by these challenges. This is historically where some of this work has fallen short and where people lose kind of hope or interest in the work, and so we believe that it's important to foreground that as one of the larger principles. Next, we believe that the work has to be rooted in measurable objectives. It's going to be absolutely essential going forward to talk about metrics. How do we measure progress? Community will be looking and asking questions about what this next body does, and we want to make sure that baked into their work are measurable objectives, guideposts that community can look to and say, we seem to still be on that journey. And last but not least, we believe that the mayor, city council, and city departments need to partner to support the work of this commission. This has to be something that we share as community. And in this, among our elected officials in particular, this is something that has to survive regime change. This is something that has to be owned by the various departments in order to be, or to be seen as authentic in terms of the work that we hope to accomplish. Having said that, you are able to read this report, and so we don't want to spend a lot of time reading the slides to you. I'm going to give a very high-level overview of the report. Then we hope to engage you in conversation, hopefully questions or observations about the work, why we decided on some of the language in the draft ordinance, so on and so forth. We believe that's probably the most productive use of our time together. So the committee, as you know, was established in June of 2021. We have several members of that committee who are here today. I won't call them out just because of time, but I will ask them to stand if they're present. Thank you. One of the things that we wanted to ensure, the co-conveners, is that we had a broad cross-section of this community that was represented. We wanted people from various walks. We had a student on our committee. We had those involved in government service, a historian, a community activist. We felt it was important to have that representation if we were going to speak substantively to this issue. And so that is part of what went into the work that we did together through this process. Our charge, as you know, was to create a framework for a permanent commission to look into the issue of reparations for the city. So we saw our work as the pre-work to the much more important and much more substantive and harder work to come, because there are some questions that are embedded in that work to come, which are very important. And we tried to craft a draft ordinance that would allow allow you to empower that body early on to begin to do that work. Once established, this commission, that permanent commission, will advise and recommend actions to address the creation of generational wealth for the American descendants of chattel slavery. It's a big conversation in our group about nomenclature, about language. That is going to be very important going forward. It's something we highlighted both in our report and in the draft committee report that we submitted, the addendum that we submitted, so that you could see some of the conversation in community about that language as well. And then last but not least, in terms of the draft ordinance itself, we not only went through the process ourselves of looking at materials, having access to a wide variety of scholarship and other materials that the St. Paul Public Library made available to us, but we also have 4 public meetings with community, 2 virtually, 2 in person, where we heard from individuals in community who shared their perspective on this work and what they hope to see come out of this process. So we wanted you to know that we took that charge very seriously, and we're trying to be as broad as possible, even with the challenges in this moment of COVID, to be thorough in the way that we engaged and solicited community feedback. In terms of priorities, this is the only slide that I'm going to read today, but it's very important. There are a couple of things that we think should inform this work, and it's slide number 6. The Advisory Commission envisions that the work of the St. Paul Recovery Act Community Reparations Commission will ensure the delivery of reparations to the members of American descendants of chattel slavery, or ADOX community, to establish the well-being of that ADOX community. And we believe the commission should follow these 3 principles. I want to read these. Number 1, be informed by the United Nations Principles for Reparations, including acknowledgement with action through restitution, rehabilitation, compensation, guarantee of non-repetition, and satisfaction in the pursuit of economic justice. Those have to be the pillars upon which this work is based. It extends beyond just an apology for slavery, which this city council did last year, which was amazing, but it commits to the long-term work of restitution. And part of that restitution is not just in the repayment of the damages that were done. It's also an acknowledgement that we're going to put into place things that will prevent this from ever happening again. That's absolutely essential to this work. And you have guidelines from the UN there. Secondly, be adequately funded and staffed to be able to fulfill its mission. I would be remiss if I didn't mention on behalf of our committee, the conveners in particular, the excellent staff that we had available to us through this process. We hope that the commission going forward will have that same level of support. It facilitated our work and also put us in the best position to fit in a timely fashion. So that'll be critical as well. Last but not least, ensure future programs are implemented in a way that measure their impact. Back to that question of metrics. Having said that, we'll move on to the draft ordinance itself. I am not going to, as I promised, read through these slides, but just kind of give you a broad overview or a high-level overview of the issues that we took on. As you would imagine, we have the preamble, which is there, which restates the purpose of the St. Paul Recovery Act Community Reparations Commission. We talked at great length about terms, vacancies, and qualifications. Our larger goal there was to ensure the seamless function of the committee itself. So we thought through issues of transitions, terms, so on and so forth, all of which is addressed in the language which we provided. One area that I do want to highlight in that section is section D on qualifications. I think this is important to emphasize for this committee. We believe to the extent possible that members shall be representatives of the city's diversity of neighborhoods, races, cultures, ages, abilities, incomes, and sexual orientation, consistent with the city's diversity and equity goals. Preference, we believe, should be given to candidates who demonstrate lived experience as it pertains to the work of the commission, are engaged in local community, and understand the role of reparations and addressing the impact of chattel slavery. It was absolutely essential to our work as a committee. We think it'll be very important going forward to have that lived experience represented. Any way that you can promote that as part of the work going forward, we think will be critical. In terms of staffing and budget, again, relatively standard here, and you can read our recommendations. In terms of meetings, we were trying to think in terms of the same flow that we were able to follow that made our work very efficient in this regard. And so standard there. The only other thing that I'm going to highlight, at least in terms of meetings, is that we also were able to work in subgroups, and we imagine and tried to create opportunity for this following commission to think in terms of the same work, to try to facilitate the ease of that work itself. Powers and duties, again, not going to spend a lot of time talking about, nor am I going to spend a lot of time talking about compensation. I think those things are self-explanatory. Where we'd like to just spend a few minutes is talking about community feedback. I can't emphasize enough how excited people in community are about this work, how thrilled they are that the City Council took the lead in providing the opportunity for us to revisit this issue in a meaningful way. However, there's a great deal of skepticism in this moment. The reason that in that first slide, when we have background, I have a copy of Eric Foner's book, Nothing But Freedom, is an acknowledgement that in the aftermath of emancipation, African Americans got nothing but freedom. There was no 40 acres and a mule. There was no guarantee to ensure or even remuneration for the work they had done to build the great state, what would become the great state of Minnesota. In acknowledging that, in this moment, a simple apology is the equivalent of nothing but freedom. A simple commitment to doing the work without signaling to community in a meaningful way that cash payments are not off the table, that we're going to be looking at a range of issues, that we're going to facilitate people being able to do the history necessary to determine if they'll be eligible, are all critical considerations. And again, that's reflected in the supplemental report that we provided to committee, but we wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. It came up in every one of the sessions. It was something that community members were adamant about. Last but not least, at least in terms of larger conversations in community itself, we did get some skepticism from people who are unsure about this, who have questions about this. I want to be clear that the process of making sure that we educate our community about why this is necessary will be absolutely essential as well. And we recommended that an education program accompany this work, that it's going to be very important to bring the community along to do the historical recovery necessary so people are really invested in the idea that this is not a handout to communities of color. This is restitution for historic injustice that continues to hurt our community socially, economically, politically. It only can result in a greater St. Paul by taking that work on. So we wanted to highlight that because that's some of the feedback that we got in community as well. To conclude with you today, I want to go back to kind of those three big questions, and I hit on two of them already. Education is going to be important. We need to create a conduit for ongoing community participation. That's the other thing that we heard. The community doesn't want, it was great that we got feedback now, but are we going to look at this commission going forward? Are they going to hold regular meetings? We addressed that in the language as well. And a lot of questions about the nature or what form reparations will take. That wasn't our charge, but we did try to think through some of those issues, and we did provide some commentary on that in the supplemental materials as well. So I want to conclude where I began. Thank you for providing this opportunity for us. We recognize that this is a historic moment. We are one of a handful of communities at this point that are at this stage. And I think probably in some meaningful ways far beyond where some other communities are, and that's a good thing. But if we don't take the proper steps to ensure the adequate funding for the programming, that the root work of the commission will be rooted in those measurable objectives that we talked about, and that there isn't this kind of shared vision among the mayor, the city council, and departments of government that this is the right thing to do, not only because it addresses this historic injustice, but because it recognizes that it takes a village, and we're the village, then we're actually setting ourselves up for failure. Everyone wants to see this succeed because they believe firmly in this vision that this will help us move forward as a community. It's the right thing to do, not only from the moral standpoint, but we believe that it will effectively help us grow and help us take on one of the biggest things that continues to haunt the community in terms of how people think about racial injustice, the fact that there's kind of a blind eye to its impact. And certainly, and I could talk about a number of issues, but I'll speak specifically to Rondo, because I do believe that that's a wound that people talk about a great deal, that those things matter, and people want to know that that's acknowledged and being dealt with in a meaningful way. I want to thank you for the time to do that high-level presentation to you. I want to ask my co-conveners if they have anything to ask and or to add, and then at that point, we'd love to open it up for conversation.
I'd also like to thank the City Council and the Mayor for their leadership on this. I believe we have one of the most solid ordinances in America right now, and we know other states are reaching out to ask us about our process. So we want St. Paul to continue to lead on the issue of reparations. Also want to acknowledge the Rondo legacy families like the Hickmans, the Davises, the Ransoms, the Crenshaws, and the Williams, who were some of the families who helped build St. Paul and were impacted by some of the institutional racism that occurred here. So we're standing on the shoulders of our ancestors and trying to complete the work that they started.
I also would like to thank the City Council. I've been a reparations advocate ever since, the 90s. And I've seen this movement ebb and flow, like many movements. But I think there are always points and times in our history in which you gain a bit more traction. And I see this as a time in which that's occurring. I hope that the council be very intentional, deliberative, and very curious, too, about the substantiveness of an issue like this. It's very rooted, entrenched in American history, and it's unfortunate, but so many of us are unaware of the, the details. So it's very good that a initiative like this will incorporate that historical educational component. But I thank you all for being open to this.
Great. Are there questions for the presenters? Mr. Tao?
Thank you, Council President. Thank you all for your leadership on this, all of you, the commission members. I think just for us to have this conversation at the City of St. Paul, other municipal across the country can only hope and dream of having this type of racial equity conversation at this table. So I want to acknowledge that the City of St. Paul has come a long way in comparing to other folks in this country. I really appreciate this, and I'm just curious as we go forward, what role does the commission members see as the county, Ramsey County, because Ramsey County also deals so much with our elders and our community that has survivor of the destruction of Rondo, they're still here, and then when it comes to health and human services, what role does the county have so that we know as we go forward what kind of partnership we can have with the county and the state as well, but in this question particularly the county?
Well, we don't want to jump too far ahead and do the work of the next commission, but a big part of reparations is health, wellness, and healing for Black families and communities. So there's a book that I know that is circulating through Ramsey County that talks about post-traumatic slavery syndrome. And one thing that I would propose if I happen to land on the next commission is making sure that people who are doing social services, who are going into the ADOC's family members' homes, are trained on post-traumatic slavery syndrome. And part of the work that this body will be doing is addressing is coming up with solutions to address post-traumatic slavery syndrome. So, and that deals with CPS, child protection services, all these different issues, even with our elders as far as curative services and things like that. So dealing with health, wellness, and healing for Black families and community and addressing post-traumatic slavery syndrome. I think social service workers in Ramsey County need to be trained on post-traumatic slavery syndrome before they engage with the ADOC's community.
You first.
Yeah. Thanks for that question, Councilmember Tao. I would say that, you know, a subject matter such as this really needs to be addressed holistically by various levels of government. And that certainly includes a partnership with the county, possibly even with the state, and even with regional governments. And I would say that because each of these levels of governments and institutions, you know, have particular sectors of society that they have more influence over. The city has economic development and planning, but the county also has some housing-related matters. And just to give you an example, members in our community have for years struggled with the issue of stable housing. We have that history of being intentionally discriminated against from living in certain communities. We have been intentionally had our communities destroyed through various mechanisms. And so if there are ways in which partnerships with these units of government can help ensure and specifically and intentionally direct resources, for example, in the stabilization of housing and pull together from their different financial streams to ensure that, you know, that could be an example of where such a partnership can be really tangibly meaningful.
And I'll be super brief and just kind of closing the loop on both those comments. I think it's also important that the city, Councilmember Town, showing leadership, actually bring the county and the state along. The reality is the reason that this has been hampered in so many other moments similar to this is that there's always the question of who initiates. So if we wait for the federal government, it's not going to happen. If we wait for the state, by the city doing this, I think you're creating the space to push that conversation to the next level and to raise the issues that Ms. Burt was speaking to in a very tangible way. If the city of St. Paul is leading on this and addressing issues of housing and healthcare, social determinants of health, as part of its reparations plan, that's going to force the county to reimagine its work. Being creative in that space, one of the things that came up among our committee members consistently was a question of whether you could use American Rescue Plan's funds, for example, to fund some of the preliminary work of the commission itself. Thinking outside the box, being creative in ways that recognize that City of St. Paul is not going to be able to address this issue for the entire state of Minnesota, but the City of St. Paul can be the spark, the conduit for this to happen in very meaningful ways because you're driving the conversation in ways that it hasn't been driven before.
Yeah, thank you for the thoughtful answer. I can only speak for myself. I'm very open to this process and to the outcome of how this will go. And I brought up the county because, you know, the great Senator Wellstone said, when we all do better, we all do better. And if our African-American brother and sister are doing well, then the county is going to do well, and state municipal is going to do well. And so I think it's strategically, as we move forward with these sort of conversation, I would try to engage them. So that's why I brought that up. But thank you for your thoughtful answer.
Thank you.
Ms. Naker.
Thanks so much, Council President. I really want to thank the members of the committee and those who presented and those who were here today and those who aren't here today for this work. It's an immense labor, and I'm just looking at the Appendix 4 resource list, which is 20-some pages of type, much smaller than my old eyes can read, to document all of the deep information and digging that you've done to justify this work. So thank you for the presentation. I am curious, you mentioned that you heard a lot of excitement from the community, and you also heard a lot of skepticism that anything will be done. And I appreciate you bringing that out loud and clear, because if there's anything that gnaws on me, it's when there is skepticism that after we do a genuine community engagement process, then that's not heard and that's not acted on. I'm curious, though, if you could share some of the questions or misconceptions or just sort of other opinions or perceptions that you think we'll need to educate people about, because I recognize that you mentioned education is a huge part of this, and this moment right now is a moment of education. So if there's anything you can share with us about what you think people should know or asked you about that you thought was interesting, I'd appreciate hearing it.
Well, that that reparations isn't a handout. It's more like a debt for harms that were against a certain group of people. So it's not charity, it's a debt. And I think educating people about the harms that have happened, even younger, so we've been able to go to schools and go to colleges and things like that. So when you start educating people about the racial wealth gap, like whites in America have $100 trillion worth of wealth, blacks have about 2.9%. That opens up eyes. We were working with Bethel, St. Thomas, Hamlin Mitchell, and when people start understanding how substantial the racial wealth gap is, they're encouraged to want to get involved and do something about it. So that type of education, and why there is such a big, why the racial wealth gap is so substantial. It's not because people are dumb, stupid, or lazy. It's because of institutional racism that has impacted the ADOS community for 400 years in the United States.
There were also kind of three big issues that came out in terms of community feedback. One was around sustainability. So what was the long-term commitment to continue this work going forward? And we heard that consistently. Is this window dressing? Is this, just the apology? And, a bunch of committees that endlessly will talk about the issue without any tangible things that we can point to or markers of progress, which is why we were very intentional about calling out the need for metrics. So that was the first one. Second was, what was the temperature and the political will? Would this survive regime change? Could this survive a change in the makeup of this council, which obviously started this work, or even a change in the mayor's office? And what could we do to bake into the fabric of the commission itself or create those commitments so that that work would meaningfully continue? And then the last one was really around direct payments. This idea that if that's not on the table, there are a lot of people who are very clear, particularly, and I don't want to say this in a way that singles these people out, but folks from the Rondo community are saying, you're not talking about 200 years now, you're talking about something that is less than a generation ago. And there are ways that you can identify and think about addressing the historic injustice that was done to that community. And so they wanted to make sure that that's not something that's taken off the table in terms of that conversation. So I'd say those three big buckets are where we heard a lot of conversation. In terms of the education piece there, I think Traren spoke to it, but I think it's also, just to talk about this from the other side, the folks that came and, for example, the one that I thought was humorous in a way was the gentleman that suggested that we all should read the work of Shelby Steele, and recommended that we needed to look at the work of people who said that African Americans should pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and why are we still having this conversation, and so on and so forth. We have to deal with, this commission has to deal with that thinking in our community and that process of education to highlight the statistics like those that Traren showed, but also to demonstrate the ways in which these are deliberate policies, practices, and procedures that have landed us in the place that we are now. Again, some of the more anecdotal response that you get, and we were very cognizant of the fact that it's going to be hard work for this commission to navigate that conversation because it transcends what's happening here in the city of St. Paul. This is national. We're in a moment now where there's a pushback against the teaching of substantive U.S. history that gets derided as critical race theory rather than just talking about the hard history that we have to acknowledge in order to move forward. So we recognize that as a fourth, but that element was not as prevalent in those sessions that we held because we believe that those individuals didn't come out to the listen session. We got one or two people and then some commentary that came in through email, and some of us received additional commentary. Once this commission takes that work to the next level, we believe that that's going to ramp up, and so this education piece will be essential in order to make sure that everyone's on the same page in terms of why we do this and how we're articulating the value proposition. I think that you just articulated, Councilman Tao. This is about a stronger St. Paul, a stronger Minnesota.
Yeah. And I would also add that I think skepticism is just rooted in the fact that we've seen different moments in our history to be corrective of our circumstance, to be thrown off track. and I think it's probably too just within our historical memory, again, based on the metrics we're espousing, that when you're not seeing sustained improvement, you have no other, reason to feel hopeful that the next opportunity to address your concerns is going to, be sustained or be real. So I think that skepticism is there based on that fact. And certainly, we were hearing a lot of concerns that, we're wanting to ensure that reparations is very much rooted and looked upon from the standpoint of lineage. Reparations is something that is owed to those of us, who are descendants and who carry that history starting from the point of slavery, because that starting point in American history is what set the trajectory for what we're experiencing today. And so I think, community members, just need to see, those realities addressed and to see some sustainability and some strong policy making.
Are there other questions or reactions? Ms. Prince?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of comments, and thanks so much for this presentation today. To Councilmember Tao's point about the county, I just want to remind the council that when we passed the resolution in January of 2021, that we did, the council asked the community, the business sector, the nonprofit sector, our public partners, philanthropy, to all be part of this, looking inward and determining what each of our responsibilities are in this matter. And the commission, when it is appointed, will have the ability to reach out as they wish. The ordinance that has been drafted gives them a charge that they can enact by really reaching out to the whole community. And so I'm really proud that when we passed this, that was our consideration, and it was that idea of the city as a catalyst for this conversation. We also know that various groups like the Minnesota Council of Churches is going through their own reparations process. There are several other cities that are doing this at this time because of the acknowledgement that if we wait for the federal government to do this, where most of us would argue the primary responsibility lays, that it wasn't happening. It had been before Congress, John Conyers' bill since the mid-'80s, I believe, and never got out of committee until last year, was it?
Mm-hmm.
So this is a really important opportunity for